There we go on to Jefferson's famous letter about the wall of separation. I just want to talk about that for a couple of seconds because there's a lot of mythology about that wall, about that letter, and coming out of the religious right, and what it means, and why it's important, what it says, what it didn't say. Just a little historical context. Jefferson received a lot of correspondence as president, just as the president does today. The difference was back then, letters they meant a lot more than we would look at a letter today. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't really remember the last time I received a handwritten letter. People email you now, or they call you or whatever. A handwritten letter is actually kind of special today to get something like that. Well, it was back then, too, even though it was more common, because that's how people communicated. But there was also an understanding, if you were a public figure, your letters oftentimes didn't remain private. And you knew that. You understood that. I mean, you could put a passage, somebody wrote to you, ask your opinion on something. You could put a passage in the letter asking them to keep it to themselves. But by and large, politicians were under the impression that their letters were going to become public. So Jefferson is president. It's a hard-fought election. He'd been accused by the Federalist-leaning clergy in New England of being an infidel. They told stories that when he was elected, he was going to go around, round up all the Bibles, have them burned, tear down the Christian foundations of the government. He'd been influenced by revolutionary rhetoric in France. He was clearly out of control. He would crush religion. So Jefferson gets this letter from a Baptist group in Connecticut, the Danbury Baptists. The Danbury Baptists are angry because they have to pay taxes to support a Congregationalist church that they don't belong to and they don't believe in. Now, there's a complex procedure you can go through to get out of paying the taxes if you live in Connecticut at the time. You can appear before a public official, have him question you about your beliefs, and maybe he'll give you the exemption, maybe he won't. Well, they were offended by the very idea that they had to do that. I mean, you would be too. If you had to appear before a government official and explain your religious beliefs, now, how dare they? The nerve. So, the Danbury Baptists, they write to Jefferson. They know he's an advocate of religious freedom. They know he believes strongly in the principle of separation of church and state. And their letter basically says, we hope your idea becomes the basis for the whole country. Because remember, when the First Amendment was written, it only applied to the federal government at that time. What's the first word of the First Amendment? Congress. Congress shall make no law. State governments could still make laws respecting an establishment of religion, and many did at that time. That changed with the 14th Amendment. I'll talk about that in a second. So, here are these Baptists, forced to pay taxes and support a church they don't believe in. They write to Jefferson to say, man, we wish your view held sway. Jefferson gets this letter and he thinks, I can use this to make a public statement about my beliefs. I'm being attacked for them. People are saying things about me that aren't true. So he sends the Baptist letter around to his Attorney General and, for some reason, to the Postmaster General, who's a friend of his named Gideon Granger. And he says, here's my reply to these Baptists. Oh, and by the way, in my reply, I'm going to explain why I don't believe I should issue days of prayer and fasting. Why I don't issue those proclamations. What do you think about my reply? And the reply contains the metaphor, the famous wall of separation between church and state. Well, Jefferson's Attorney General is a guy named Levi Lincoln. He gets a little bit nervous. He says, you know what, I'd take out that stuff about the days of prayer and fasting. That's just going to antagonize them up in New England. You don't want to get into that. Jefferson, he takes it out. But he writes a little margin note on the letter. Something, I took this out because it was recommended it would offend my friends in New England. He keeps that in the draft of the letter. He writes his response. He sends it to the Danbury Baptist. Now, he knows it's going to become public. He even says so. In his cover memo to Levi Lincoln and Gideon Granger, he says, I want to send these views out. I hope that they'll become part of people's political beliefs. It's a way of sowing seeds, political seeds of thought. So I bring that up is because sometimes you hear people on the right, the religious right, saying, oh, that letter Jefferson wrote to the Baptists, he just dashed that off in an afternoon. He wasn't even thinking about the response. It's not important. No, that's exactly wrong. It was very important. Jefferson knew that it would become public. He knew that it would become the definitive statement of his views. He screened it by 2 top-level government officials before he sent it. And he sent it out there, and it's had a lasting impact. So that's the next piece of information, that this was a very deliberate kind of thing, that the separation of church and state was well thought out, that it was planned, that it wasn't just something that happened by accident. Third piece of information. What did these framers believe personally about religion? Now, the reason I bring this up is because if you listen to the religious right, you'll get the impression that our founding fathers were kind of like Jerry Falwell and powdered wigs. They were fundamentalist Christians. They believed in this idea of literal Bible and the whole story's true, and that they were fundamentalists. And they were not. They were very far from fundamentalist. And I want to talk about 4 men in particular. Here's a sad thing. I doubt today the first 4 presidents of this country could be elected. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. They probably couldn't be elected today because of their religious views. They would be considered too unorthodox. Let's begin with Washington. Washington is an interesting character because, well, he didn't. When he talked about religion, he tended to be fairly reticent about it. We do know, according to Philander Chase, who keeps the papers of George Washington at the University of Virginia, that Washington never really talked in private letters or public letters about Jesus, Christ, or Christianity. He said he was a Christian, but he almost always used terms like divine providence, supreme architect of the universe. This is what he believed. Here's what Chase said. We do not know of any instance of Washington preaching in a church or a congregation. Like many people in the 18th century, including Voltaire, Washington thought religion was necessary underpinning for public virtue and moral behavior, although scholars debate to what extent it influenced his personal code of conduct. We have not found any instance where Washington used the names Jesus or Christ either separately or together in his personal correspondence. He did not justify his religious beliefs in detail during his life. Now, that's because Washington had this sort of deistic belief of a sort of a supreme architect of the universe who put things into motion and then kind of step back a little bit. The deist, it's an unpopular view today or not so well known today, but the deist believed in a God of first cause, but not necessarily a God that you could appeal to. So the idea of praying or asking God to do something for you was a little bit strange to the deist because God maybe didn't operate that way. God put things into motion, but wasn't really the kind of God that was going to come down and intervene in the affairs of humankind. So that's Washington. Washington had a strange habit, too, of tending to leave church services before communion took place. Why? People speculate about that. He seemed to have some kind of a problem with that particular practice. He would leave the church. Washington's views, I call them social utilitarian. The social utilitarian view of religion is that religion is necessary for public morals. That people need religion in order to stay good. Now, we can disagree with that. Obviously, a lot of people would say humanists and non-believers, most of them are good. They don't necessarily have religious belief. But in Washington's time, it was a very common idea to look at religion as a social utilitarian thing. It had a role to play safeguarding public virtues and morals. So you needed it for that reason. That's the social utilitarian view. And that's what I think really Washington adhered to. It certainly wouldn't be enough to get him very far in politics today. Washington also wrote one of the famous letters about religious freedom, his famous letter to the Truro Synagogue in Connecticut, where he talked about the importance of religious liberty in this country and endorsed the idea that Jews would have complete religious liberty, just as Christians and others do, because our country has a First Amendment that gives everybody religious freedom. That was a letter to a synagogue, so obviously Washington wasn't thinking that we were a Christian nation or that we had only religious freedom for Christians, because he was assuring the Jews that they too would always have their religious freedom. What about